Good evening, friends. It's Friday once again, and I'm back with another tale from my collections. This time from my novel, R.A.L.F. Before I begin, though, I would like to share a short tale about my inspiration for this novel. It's called Drones. Cheyenne Mountain loomed above, casting its shadow across the landscape of the Broadmoor, Colorado, as I found myself coming to the end of another workday. Standing to stretch muscles made tired from rebuilding a roof, I pondered the many things happening deep within the mountain as I gazed at the tall security fences, radar dish, and antennas at the opening to NORAD, North American Air Defense Command. With the Air Force Academy to the north, Peterson Air Force Base to the east, and Fort Carson at its doorstep, NORAD was the fourth point of a map surrounding a military community. I saw the movie War Games, but unlike others, I possessed special knowledge that most do not. No, nothing classified, but rather, as one of the many thousands of residents of Colorado Springs, I knew without a doubt that if there was ever a full-out nuclear war, I would likely never know, because NORAD is target one for foreign intercontinental ballistic missiles. As a veteran who started his time in the Army as a helicopter mechanic at Fort Carson, I was well aware of just what it meant to live at ground zero. I was also intensely interested in video games. More importantly, video games about flying and aerial combat. Yeah, I'm a gamer. How much do I like video games? At the time I was working on this project in Colorado Springs, I was also developing an in-home cockpit for my flight simulators so I could get into the games even more. Lucky for me, when I re-enlisted in the Army in 1987, I was shipped off to Lowry Air Force Base in Aurora, Colorado to become an audiovisual engineer. Yep, 8 months of 8 hours a day in electronics training at the Community College of the Air Force, and I was given the ability to not only repair electronics and maintain television studios, but to design circuitry. I enhanced this training while working as an engineer in Germany by going to college at night and learning about computers. These were the skills at my disposal for making my own video games. My thoughts were interrupted by a low-flying jet aircraft, and I looked up to see an F-16 doing combat maneuvers over the mountain. The pilot was low enough to see me on the roof, and when I waved to him on his next pass, I was rewarded with the rocking of his wings before he disappeared over the mountains. How cool is that? I immediately felt a kinship with this unknown Air Force officer, and then a sadness came over me. Was this pilot one of the guys who came back from Desert Storm, or one of the guys who would be fighting in the next conflict? It was too bad there wasn't some way our young pilots could fly these magnificent aircraft without having to worry about being shot down. These thoughts haunted me as I returned home that evening and went back to working on my cockpit. At some point while I was testing my creation, my thoughts returned happily to the days when I was a boy and got my first flying lesson. My father took me up in his Cessna Skyhawk, and after leaving the pattern, told me to grab the controls, much as one of the helicopter maintenance test pilots would do in the Army many years later. Then my thoughts turned to other days flying remote control airplanes in the park, and suddenly it all came together. Abandoning my project, I sat at the computer and tried to get my thoughts on paper as fast as they seemed to be spilling from my mind. I envisioned a world where fighter pilots flew their deadly aircraft from the safety of control rooms in cockpits. Someone would have to build and test these cockpits, and there would be others needed to create the software necessary to control such complex remote-controlled aircraft. Then they would need to redesign the planes and replace the pilot with remote-control flight gear. Surely our technology was advanced enough to accomplish this. The ideas seemed to flow forever, and when I was done, there were many pages written about this. Sitting back in my chair, I looked at the clock and was surprised to see the sun would be coming up soon. Good thing it was Friday night because there was no way I'd be ready to go to work in a couple hours. I turned off the computer and looked fondly at the notebooks containing my heretofore unpublished books, The Storyteller, Dark Fragments, and Pursuing Phantoms. Next to them was an empty folder waiting to be filled with Eternal Convictions, which waited patiently at the end of Chapter 8 for me to continue writing. I got up to leave the room, and as I stood in the doorway reaching for the light switch, my gaze traveled across the wall behind my chair. That wall was literally covered in rejection letters from publishers and agents alike. It seemed publishers were not interested in authors without agents, and agents were not interested in unpublished authors. Somewhere in the darkest recesses of my mind, I protested this catch-22, even as another thought began to form. 1995 could be my year. Sure, it was already late summer, but what if I were to write a story about remote-controlled fighter planes? The wheels turned as I returned to my desk, and when my wife called me to the dinner table, I was well on my way to writing R.A.L.F, Remote Air Logistics Fighter. A story about how two boys would revolutionize the way wars were fought in the cockpit if they could keep their ever-competitive urges in check. Life has a way of getting complicated, and though I finished writing R.A.L.F in 1995, I was not able to publish it until 2009. In the meantime, I cannot help but be pleased as I see our country develop drones for use in combat. I do not condone their use over our homeland, except for small, unarmed scientific drones being tested for use in agriculture. I have mixed feelings about their use overall, but the fact is, for every drone shot down, there is a wife, or maybe a little boy or a little girl, who's happy because Daddy will be coming home. Well, I hope I didn't bore you with that little preface about my novel. Now it's time to grab a snack, dim the lights, and let me take you into the night with a story I call Fight or Flight. Commander Bobby McCall, call sign Thor, completed the pre-flight of his F-15 Strike Eagle as the base warning klaxon began to blare. Overhead, the loudspeaker warned of an enemy aircraft approaching at low altitude from the east at subsonic speed. Reacting from instinct and his training as a fighter pilot, McCall climbed into the cockpit of his aircraft, kicking the ladder away. As one hand reached back to close the canopy, his other flipped breakers on the control panel to engage the aircraft's systems. Tower, this is Strike Eagle 109er requesting permission for takeoff, he said into his mic as the turbine started to whine. Roger 109er, you're clear to scramble. McCall released the wheel brakes and guided the plane to the runway. As he turned from the tarmac, a thunderous roar shook his plane and he looked up to see an enemy F-5 Tiger flying low overhead in a high-speed pass. Bullets from the enemy's 20mm cannon ripped up the runway behind him as he pushed the throttle to full, engaging the afterburners. Pinned to the seat momentarily, as sudden engine thrust pushed his aircraft toward the far end of the runway, he saw the enemy plane to his left bank hard right to come across directly ahead of him. McCall pulled back hard on the stick, causing the plane to jump from the ground as he retracted the landing gear and engaged the lethal Sidewinder missiles mounted at his wingtips. Another flick of the wrist brought the radar screen to life and he switched it from the track while scan mode into single target track mode. The radar was already locked onto the enemy aircraft as McCall looked up to the heads-up display for target designation. The enemy aircraft was positioned on his display within the sighting reticle. As the F-5 turned 90 degrees to avoid the approaching Strike Eagle, the target designator locked onto the aircraft in a red diamond. A sharp, piercing tone erupted in his headset, letting McCall know the target was locked, and he pulled the trigger to fire a missile. A bright flash and a cloud of smoke erupted from his left wing as the missile streaked off to find its target, and McCall watched patiently. The F-5 banked hard left, but it was too late. The heat-seeking projectile rammed into his exhaust like a long-lost lover and exploded in multicolored spasms of fire and debris. McCall banked his plane to a heading of 95 degrees to avoid debris and switched the weapons systems off. Looking over his shoulder, he watched the wreckage of the enemy plane fall smoking to the ground in a mass of twisted technology. Scratch one bandit. Reaching into his flight vest, McCall pulled out a licorice stick and thrust it between his teeth. Warm anise taffy soothed him after the unexpected and ultimately short-lived dogfight, allowing him to concentrate on his original objective. When the bogey interrupted his pre-flight check, McCall had been preparing himself for a mission. Adrenaline pumped through his body, giving him a charge which would last through the day. Tower, this is 109er. Bandit is terminated, now proceeding heading 95 degrees to secondary target. Roger, Thor. Hellcat says to watch your 6 up there. You're flying into heavy surface-to-air missiles and patrols. Roger, Tower. Drop into Angels 1. Inform when you no longer have a visual. McCall pushed forward on the stick to allow the aircraft to descend. As it reached 1,000 feet, he eased back to slow the descent and trim the throttle. Today's mission called for entry into enemy territory undetected with a sudden appearance amidst destruction. This tactic was a well-known way to demoralize the enemy while taking out his weaponry. McCall smiled to himself as he waited for the tower to confirm they had lost him on the radar. If they couldn't see him, then neither could the enemy. 109er, we just lost your track. What is your altitude, over? Tower, this is 109er. I'm skimming the deck at 600 feet. Any lower, and I could wash this bird. Roger, Thor. Good hunting. Tower out. McCall performed a quick check of his systems to ensure none of the active radar was engaged and settled himself more comfortably into the seat. The Persian Gulf below sent sparkles of sunlight shimmering into the air, and he turned back to look at his instruments. It wouldn't do to become hypnotized by the water and ditch his bird when he had 2 targets to eliminate before lunch. Referring to the global positioning system, he checked his position and heading with that of the first target. The map on his knee indicated he was still 100 kilometers from the first objective and approaching at nearly 15 kilometers per minute for an expected arrival time of just over 6 minutes. At 30 kilometers out from the target, McCall flipped on the active targeting radar, switched it to ground target ranging mode, and armed the AGM-65E laser-guided missiles. Pulling back on the stick, he pushed the aircraft to an attack altitude of 2,000 feet and began to scan for the target. Ahead, he could see a rocket launcher near the point of Kark Island, surrounded by an arsenal of rockets. A shrill beeping sounded, and he looked to the early warning radar to find the enemy had launched a Hawk missile his way. He locked the radar onto target and held his breath. At 10 kilometers out from the objective, he triggered the laser-guided Mavericks twice to ensure he would decimate the area. Pulling back hard and left on the stick, McCall applied full left rudder, putting the plane into a banking climb, and triggered chaff decoys to throw off the enemy missile. Looking out to his left, he breathed a sigh of relief as he watched the Hawk missile soaring off into the distance. The chaff had worked, and the projectile lost him. Now he turned his attention to the missile launcher on the island, and was pleased to see a large black cloud of smoke rising from the location. Secondary explosions flashed within the smoke as the arsenal of missiles ignited. Checking his map, McCall turned the plane to a heading of 305 and the next target. Enemy ground troops were using the bridge at Abadan to move from Iran into the little country of Kuwait, threatening the international airport at Kuwait City. His first target, the SAM site, had been a diversionary tactic to put the enemy patrols behind him as he made for the bridge and then home. Consulting his radar, several blips warned that enemy aircraft had taken off from the area and now pursued him. McCall hit the afterburners and leveled off at 3,000 feet. The next target was approximately 170 kilometers away. The airspeed indicator showed his aircraft velocity at 750 knots, which translated to roughly 23 kilometers per minute. At this rate, he would be upon the target in 7.5 minutes. Time passed slowly as he watched the endless water below. He knew the enemy planes would be on his trail and radioing to their comrades at the desert airbase in Bandar-Kameni to intercept. For the first time since his last mission in Vietnam, McCall began to wish for air support. The village of Bandar-Kameni also had a SAM site, and there was no available data on the village of Shadigan, which he would pass at a mere 5 kilometers. Ahead, he could see the village of Shadigan near the rainy coast. He crossed his fingers and prayed there was no ground-to-air defense located there. Active radar indicated that the nearest enemy fighter was still 40 kilometers away, and he knew he would have to slow down to ensure he hit the bridge. A loud noise to his right caught his attention, and McCall turned to see 2 bullet holes in the canopy. One where the little projectile had come in, and another where it exited. Somebody down there almost got lucky with small arms fire. Wind whistled from the holes, but there was no other damage apparent. He could see the bridge ahead and pulled back on the throttle to reduce his speed to just over 300 knots. Taking care to aim well, he locked the remaining 4 missiles on the bridge and triggered them. As the missiles left the wing, accelerating to the target, McCall pushed the throttles full and banked hard left. Shrill beeping added to his adrenaline rush, and he looked quickly at the radar for the direction of the incoming ground-to-air missile. There it was on his screen, approaching from his right. He reached out to hit the chaff and flare release, but was pushed back in his seat as a hard jolt shuddered the aircraft. A quick scan showed no major damage, and he looked through the canopy for signs of the hit. On the left, he could see the twisted, smoking remains of a missile falling away from the plane, and his eye caught on the tail where the missile had struck the tail of the aircraft, twisting his rudder and ripping the antennas from it. It had been sheer luck that the missile had not detonated. If it had, there would have been nothing left of the rear half of the aircraft. He tried the rudder controls at his feet, but they were stiff. Using his ailerons to turn the plane, McCall changed his heading to 185 and hit the afterburners. He had to get back into friendly airspace before the enemy fighters caught up with him. His radar showed the nearest enemy plane bearing 135 degrees at a range of 25 kilometers. Within moments, the bandits would be in range for an attack, and there was nothing he could do about it. A warning buzzer erupted from the master caution panel, and he was dismayed to see that the missile had ruptured his hydraulic lines. The plane was getting critically low on hydraulic pressure. Consulting the active global positioning system, McCall found he was only 20 kilometers from Kuwait City now. If he could keep the bird in the air long enough to get it there, he just might be able to make an emergency landing. Again, shrill beeping of an incoming missile filled the cockpit, but this time it was from an incoming MiG-29. He hit the flare and chaff release several times and tried to put the bird into a banking dive, but there was no response from the controls. He keyed the mic and radioed his distress. "Hellcat, this is Strike Eagle 109er. I've lost all flight control. My position is approximately 10 kilometers from Kuwait City bearing 015 degrees. Request rescue. I have to eject," McCall said, fighting back the fear. Reaching back over his shoulders, he grabbed the ejection handle and pulled forward and down as hard as he could. The canopy blew away from the aircraft with a loud bang, and he felt himself propelled upward as the charge under his seat pushed him out into the sky. His seat fell away as the parachute deployed, and he watched in dismay as the incoming missile impacted his plane and hurled it sideways in a shattered ball of flame and wreckage. McCall scanned the horizon, looking hard for the enemy aircraft as he wondered if the tower received his mayday. Below him, waves of sand promised a soft landing as well as isolation, and he was glad to be behind friendly lines. "Man, I almost made it," Bobby McCall said as he got up from his chair, watching his pilot ride the parachute to the ground. Bobby quickly scanned the mission results page of his computer's flight simulator, smiling to himself. He may have lost an airplane, but he completed the mission goals and pushed the computer battle into the next sector. He turned the computer off and went to get his chores done. Tonight, he planned to ask his dad to help him build a lifelike simulator in his room. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you for spending your time with me. Tell me what you think in the comments, and I'll be sure to join the conversation. That's all for now, but I'll be back again next Friday with another story, just for you. Until then, sleep well.